Another day, another Trump controversy. This time, it's about Ukraine. Trump erupted during a White House meeting with Zelensky, fueling speculation about his growing alignment with Putin. As European leaders stand by Ukraine, Trump is blaming Zelensky for the war and warning of World War III. But what exactly went down behind closed doors? And is this the beginning of a deeper rift in the US-Ukraine alliance? Watch this video to the end to find out. Trump's latest tantrum. When Volodymyr Zelensky walked into the White House, he wasn't expecting a warm embrace, but he also wasn't expecting a political brawl that would leave him storming out empty-handed. If anyone thought this meeting was going to be a diplomatic success, they were in for a rude awakening. Donald Trump's latest outburst at the White House has left European leaders shaking their heads and throwing their full support behind Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky. Before the meeting, the stakes were high. Ukraine needed unwavering support, and Trump wanted to redefine America's role on the global stage. But the result was a collision course that left European allies scrambling and Zelensky reeling. The conversation started with a polite exchange, but that facade cracked the moment Vice President J.D. Vance suggested that diplomacy, rather than military aid, was the key to ending Ukraine's suffering. If you've been following the war, you know that talking to Vladimir Putin about peace is about as effective as negotiating with a storm to stop a hurricane. Zelensky wasn't buying it. Nobody stopped him, Zelensky fired back, pointing out that Russia's aggression didn't begin in 2022. It was years in the making. Vance, unfazed, pushed back. He stood his ground that diplomacy is the only way to end the destruction of Ukraine. What he said basically means that it's time for Ukraine to start making concessions to Russia. That comment alone could have ended the meeting right then and there, but oh no, this was just the beginning. Up until this point, Trump was letting Vance do most of the talking, but Zelensky made one comment that set him off like a firecracker. Zelensky, frustrated, told Trump,
"First of all, during the war, everybody has problems, even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future."
Now telling Trump what he will feel in the future is like waving a red flag in front of a bull. He was not about to let that slide. Trump snapped back at Zelensky even before he could finish talking.
"Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel."
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly what you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
And just like that, the gloves were off. The idea that Zelensky was warning Trump about the dangers of appeasing Putin, that struck a nerve. Trump has always seen this war as a both sides issue. Ukraine and Russia just need to sit down, hash things out, and boom, problem solved. Zelensky, however, wasn't about to let Trump rewrite history. Trump, now visibly irritated, leaned in.
Not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
This was no longer just a discussion, it was a public shaming. Trump quickly reminded Zelensky about the situation in his country.
Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
If there's one thing Trump does well, it's framing a situation to his advantage, and he wasted no time in reminding Zelensky just how much the US had given Ukraine over the years.
You haven't been alone.
Cabinet,
you haven't been
only
alone.
in this cabinet.
We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion. We gave you military equipment, and you men are brave, but they had to use our military. If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
Ah, and there it was. The classic Trump move. Bash Biden, downplay US aid, and make it seem like Zelensky was just some ungrateful beggar. Then Vance jumped in, accusing Zelensky of secretly campaigning for the Democrats by visiting a weapons factory in Biden's hometown during the election year. Republicans saw that visit as a slap in the face, almost like Zelensky was endorsing Biden over Trump. At this point, the tension in the room was unbearable. Zelensky tried to reason with them, but Trump wasn't interested.
You're not winning. You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
It was clear by now this meeting wasn't about strategy or partnerships. It was about power, and Trump wanted Zelensky to know exactly who held the cards. After all the back and forth, Vance had one last demand.
Just say thank you.
That's right. They didn't want explanations, they didn't want pushback, they just wanted gratitude. When Zelensky refused to grovel, Trump lost whatever patience he had left. "It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this," he muttered. "It's going to be a tough deal to make because the attitude attitudes have to change. And then the meeting was over. No minerals deal, no handshake agreement, nothing. As Zelensky's car pulled away from the White House, Trump jumped on social media to get the last word in. "Come back when you're ready for peace," he posted. If Trump thought he could bully Zelensky into submission without consequences, he was wrong. European leaders wasted no time throwing their support behind Ukraine. French President Emmanuel Macron, in a firm statement, reminded the world that there is an aggressor, Russia, there is a victim, Ukraine. We were right to help Ukraine and sanction Russia 3 years ago, and to keep doing so. Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof echoed similar sentiments, emphasizing all he wants is a lasting peace and an end to the war of aggression, started by Russia, for Ukraine and its people, and for Europe. Germany's outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz added to the chorus of support, stating that no one wants peace more than the citizens of Ukraine. His successor in waiting, Friedrich Merz, reinforced that stance by warning against confusing the aggressor and the victim in the ongoing conflict. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock went a step further, describing the White House debacle as a bad dream and calling for stronger European efforts to support Ukraine should the US withdraw its aid. Even NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, though careful with his words, hinted at the growing transatlantic divide, revealing that he had spoken with Zelensky twice following the clash with Trump. While he refrained from divulging details, Rutte admitted that Zelensky needed to find a way to restore relations with the US, an indication of the diplomatic headaches the incident had caused. Support for Ukraine poured in from not only Europe but also from allies across the world. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau assured Zelensky that Canada will continue to stand with Ukraine and Ukrainians in achieving a just and lasting peace. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese spoke about his country's commitment, stating that Australia had proudly supported the brave people of Ukraine in their struggle to defend their sovereignty against the brutality of Russian aggression and in support of international law. The European Union's top officials, Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen, issued a joint statement assuring Zelensky that he was never alone. Their words were reinforced by leaders from Austria, Belgium, Croatia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Moldova, Romania, Sweden, and Slovenia, all of whom publicly reaffirmed their backing of Ukraine. However, not all voices in Europe aligned against Trump. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban took to social media to defend him, stating that strong men make peace, weak men make war. Today, President Trump stood bravely for peace, even if it was difficult for many to digest. Thank you, Mr. President. Orban's remarks were met with criticism from European counterparts who saw Trump's approach as anything but diplomatic. Despite the rocky encounter in Washington, Zelensky took to social media, thanking world leaders for their words of encouragement. Writing on Telegram, he emphasized the importance of Ukraine being heard globally, stating, "It is very important for us that Ukraine is heard and that no one forgets about it, neither during the war nor after." He reinforced the message that Ukraine was not alone and that its cause remained at the forefront of international discussions. The optics of the meeting were disastrous. Instead of looking like a peacemaker, Trump came off as dismissive and aggressive. Instead of securing a new deal, he alienated an ally. And instead of showing strength, he ended up showing the world just how chaotic US foreign policy could become under his leadership. Zelensky, for his part, remained defiant. He knew this meeting could go south, but even he probably didn't expect it to collapse this fast. He had walked into the White House hoping for a breakthrough. Instead, he got a front row seat to one of Trump's most explosive tantrums yet. Trump's clash with Zelensky has left many wondering, what's next for the US-Ukraine relationship? With Trump showing sympathy for Putin and accusing Ukraine of gambling with World War III, this alliance faces its biggest test yet: the US-Ukraine alliance. The relationship between the United States and Ukraine has seen plenty of ups and downs over the years. It all started in 1991. The US officially recognized Ukraine's independence. Just a few weeks later, in January 1992, the US upgraded its consulate in Kyiv to an embassy, sealing the start of what was supposed to be a strong diplomatic partnership. Over the years, this relationship had its rocky moments, like in 2002, when Ukraine got caught up in a scandal involving an alleged sale of military tech to Saddam Hussein's Iraq. But despite everything, the US remained a key ally. Things really escalated after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. From that point on, the US became one of Ukraine's biggest defense partners, supplying military aid and standing firmly against Russian aggression. Then, in 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, the US ramped up its support even more. Under President Joe Biden, military aid skyrocketed, with billions of dollars flowing into Ukraine to help them fight back against Putin's forces. America was all in, and most most Americans seem to agree it was the right thing to do, at least at the time. But then came Trump. Trump has been trying to position himself as the guy who can end the war between Russia and Ukraine. He's been vocal about his belief that the conflict should have never escalated the way it did, but his stance has been leaning more and more toward Putin's perspective, and let's just say Ukraine is not happy about that. During their recent meeting at the White House, Trump and Zelensky were supposed to be strengthening their alliance. They had a minerals deal to sign, which would have been a significant step in securing Ukraine's access to vital resources while reinforcing security ties with the US. Instead, the meeting spiraled into a heated back and forth, with Trump telling Zelensky to make a deal with Russia or the US is out. Trump essentially told Ukraine to negotiate with the very country that invaded them. Zelensky, unsurprisingly, wasn't having it. He pushed back, insisting that there could be no compromises with Putin, not after everything that's happened. But Trump, who has never been one to take well to defiance, accused Zelensky of being ungrateful and gambling with World War III. Now let's break that down for a second. Trump, the same man who's been saying he could stop the war in 24 hours if elected, is suddenly blaming Zelensky for the entire situation. According to him, Ukraine should have started peace talks earlier, and the fact that they haven't is somehow their fault. That's quite a statement, considering Russia was the one that rolled its tanks into Ukrainian territory in February 2022 and currently controls about 20% of the country. To make matters worse, Trump wasn't the only one in the room questioning Ukraine's approach. His vice president, J.D. Vance, also jumped in, telling Zelensky that the war needed to end through diplomacy. Trump piled on, saying Ukraine had been receiving US support for 3 years and that Zelensky had no right to tell America how it should feel about the war. By this point, the meeting was completely off the rails. Zelensky, likely realizing there was nothing productive left to be said, left the White House earlier than planned. But Trump wasn't done. He took to Truth Social, his own social media platform, to express his frustrations, saying Zelensky disrespected the US in its cherished Oval Office. He went on to declare that Zelensky wasn't ready for peace and that America's involvement was giving Ukraine an unfair advantage in negotiations. "I don't want advantage," Trump wrote. "I want peace." Zelensky, for his part, tried to salvage what he could. He thanked the US multiple times on social media and later told Fox News that the argument was not good, but the relationship between the two countries could still be repaired. He pointed out that the alliance wasn't just about the two presidents, it was about the connection between their nations and their people. Meanwhile, the political reactions to this clash were about as divided as you'd expect. Republicans, for the most part, rallied behind Trump. Senator Lindsey Graham, who once strongly supported Ukraine, said that what he saw in the Oval Office was so disrespectful that he wasn't sure if the US could do business with Zelensky again. He even suggested that Ukraine should consider finding a new leader who would be easier to work with. On the other hand, Democrats were furious. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries called the whole situation appalling and warned that treating Zelensky this way would only serve to embolden Putin. And over in Europe, let's just say they were not impressed with Trump's approach. And Russia? Oh, they were absolutely loving this. The Kremlin released a statement saying that Trump and Vance had shown restraint during the meeting. A foreign ministry spokeswoman even went as far as to call it a miracle that they didn't physically attack Zelensky. That's the level of pettiness we're dealing with here. This whole mess has obviously put the US-Ukraine alliance on shaky ground. The Secretary of State even stepped in to demand an apology from Zelensky, calling his behavior antagonistic. But let's be real, after everything Ukraine has been through, an apology to Trump probably isn't high on their list of priorities. And if Trump really does decide to cut aid, it's going to change everything for Ukraine. They've been relying heavily on American weapons, intelligence, and funding to keep up their fight against Russia. Losing that support? That's a nightmare scenario. So, what happens next? Well, that's the big question. Trump seems determined to shake things up, and if he follows through on his threats, Ukraine could be left scrambling for new allies. Europe has been stepping up its support, but whether they can fill the gap the US would leave behind is another story. Meanwhile, Russia is watching all of this unfold, and you can bet Putin is loving every second of it. The US-Ukraine alliance has been through a lot, but this might be its biggest test yet, and if Trump keeps going down this road, we might be looking at a very different world order before long. For now, one thing is clear: Zelensky isn't backing down, and neither is Trump. But if their recent clash is any indication, the US-Ukraine alliance as we know it is at serious risk. And with a war still raging, that's a pretty big deal. History has seen its fair share of complicated alliances, and Trump's handling of Ukraine is just the latest chapter in a long book of high-stakes diplomacy. Other heated presidential exchanges. When world leaders go head-to-head, the fallout can shape history for decades. A tense exchange, a moment of frustration, or even a single misstep can shift alliances, spark conflicts, or change the course of diplomacy. Trump's fiery response to Europe's latest move after his uncomfortable meeting with Zelensky is just another entry in a long list of heated presidential confrontations that have left a lasting mark on global politics. These encounters aren't just about egos clashing. They set the tone for international relations. Some pushed the world closer to war, while others, ironically, laid the groundwork for diplomacy. Let's take a deep dive into some of the most intense, awkward, and downright dramatic confrontations between US presidents and foreign leaders, where the stakes were high and tempers flared. John F. Kennedy walked into his 1961 meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna with optimism, hoping for a productive dialogue. But Khrushchev had other plans. He saw Kennedy as young, inexperienced, and untested. Instead of a standard diplomatic exchange, Khrushchev took the gloves off, verbally hammering Kennedy on Berlin and nuclear weapons. The Soviet leader issued a bold ultimatum, demanding that Western forces withdraw from West Berlin. Kennedy was taken aback, later admitting the meeting was the worst thing in his life. The fallout was immediate. Khrushchev left the meeting convinced that the US president was weak, and within months, the Berlin crisis exploded. By August, the Berlin Wall was going up, a direct result of that hostile exchange. What was supposed to be a high-level diplomatic engagement turned into one of the defining moments of the Cold War. Fast forward to 1986, and another tense US-Soviet showdown took place. This time, it was between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in Reykjavik, Iceland. The two leaders were on the verge of a historic arms control agreement that could have eased Cold War tensions. But then came the sticking point: Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, dubbed Star Wars. Gorbachev demanded the US scrap the program. Reagan wouldn't budge. Just like that, the talks fell apart. It seemed like a diplomatic disaster at the time, but history had other plans. That heated argument in Iceland eventually paved the way for future nuclear treaties. What looked like a failure turned into a stepping stone for progress, proving that even the most intense confrontations can lead to something bigger. Then came George W. Bush's infamous encounter with Vladimir Putin in June 2001. Meeting in Slovenia, Bush made the now infamous remark that he had looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul. He walked away believing he had met a man deeply committed to his country. In hindsight, a wildly optimistic take. While their early relationship was cordial, things took a turn. As the US pushed NATO expansion and missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, Putin saw these moves as direct threats to Russia's security. The goodwill from their first meeting evaporated. By the time Bush left office, the US and Russia were once again on opposing sides, with rising tensions and an increasingly assertive Kremlin. Not all presidential clashes happen in Cold War settings, though. Take Barack Obama's icy dealings with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Their relationship was never particularly warm, but things reached an uncomfortable peak in 2010 during a White House meeting. Obama, frustrated over Israeli settlement expansion, wanted Netanyahu to offer some concessions. Netanyahu stood firm. What did Obama do? He left the meeting, not as a dramatic walkout, but to go have dinner with his family, leaving Netanyahu and his aides to figure things out. It was a calculated move, seen by some as a diplomatic snub, by others as a power play. Either way, it showed just how strained their dynamic was, with tensions flaring over Middle East policy throughout Obama's presidency. The most dramatic of all heated presidential exchanges happened in 2018 when Trump failed in a historic summit with Kim Jong-un, president of North Korea. He walked away calling it a pretty comprehensive agreement and a huge win for the US, but many critics saw it as nothing more than a high-profile handshake with vague promises that didn't amount to much. The document they signed looked official. There was ceremony, smiles, and a lot of fanfare, but when you actually read it, it was barely a page long. That's right, a single page, light on specifics, and full of broad statements that could mean anything or nothing at all. The whole point of this summit was to get North Korea to give up its nukes, but Kim didn't exactly promise that. Instead, he nodded along to a commitment he had already made before and then broken. There was no timeline, no step-by-step plan, no system for verification. It was just vague. Meanwhile, Trump gave away something significant. He agreed to halt military exercises with South Korea, and just like that, one of America's biggest bargaining chips was off the table in exchange for a verbal agreement with no real substance. This sudden concession also blindsided South Korea, the US military, and even members of Trump's own administration. No one saw it coming. And then there's the elephant in the room. Kim is a leader who runs brutal prison camps, cracks down on dissent, and maintains an iron grip on his people. But that didn't get much attention during the summit. Instead, Trump focused on how well they got along and how strong their great relationship was. The summit did not exactly achieve anything, but it was historic in that it marked the first meeting between a sitting US president and a North Korean leader. But in terms of concrete, verifiable results, It was more style than substance. North Korea got to appear cooperative on the world stage without giving up anything tangible, while the US walked away with a promise that may not have been worth the paper it was written on. At the end of the day, this wasn't the diplomatic triumph Trump claimed it to be. It was a spectacle, a show, a moment in history that ultimately led nowhere. If past experience is any guide, North Korea isn't known for keeping its promises. So, was this summit a game changer? Maybe for Kim, for everyone else? Not so much. Presidential clashes like these aren't just headline material, they shape the world. Some, like Reagan and Gorbachev's back and forth, led to historic agreements. Others, like Kennedy and Khrushchev's face-off, pushed the world to the brink. Even seemingly minor moments like Bush's misplaced trust in Putin ended up defining foreign policy for years. So, what about Trump and Zelensky? What does this latest confrontation mean for the future? Will it damage US-Ukraine relations, alter America's stance in Ukraine's war with Russia? And, more importantly, how is Putin watching all of this unfold? If history has taught us anything, it's that world leaders never forget these moments. A single fiery exchange can shift alliances and reshape global strategies. Trump's latest outburst could very well be another turning point, with consequences that won't be fully understood for years. Time has a way of revealing just how much one heated conversation can change the world. If you found this video interesting, click on any of the cards on your screen to check out more exciting stories about it.